Okay, we are recording. So if you have any questions, let me know. Next week should be a busy one, because I know some of you are concerned about your grades. So that means it's going to be busy for me and busy for you. So make sure you turn in any work you've missed. Make sure you make any corrections. Make sure you, if it's a correction on independent work or a lab, make sure you reply to a comment so I know to do it. But also as a reminder, those are, how do I put this? So those are old assignments. So, as I get caught up with new assignments, and I go back and do old assignments. So that's how the system works. So I'll do my best to get them done in time, but we'll see. So yeah, do that. And again, a 5% boost to any grade if you meet me and get feedback. Or what was it? The most recent? Did I post recent changes? Yeah, the most recent announcement was slightly different because I really want to encourage people with, especially the lower grades, to meet me and get feedback so we can talk about why this is the right answer and why this is the wrong answer. So yeah, as you can see in the announcements, that if you have an even lower grade, right, the lower your grade, the bigger your boost. But yeah, so highly recommend it. And we have 2 minutes left, so let's do another extra credit attendance word, and that is Kentucky. Other reminders, I'll remind you that we do not have lab next week. That's just a free week. I've just taken your highest lab grade and reused it. And for most of you, that is a 20, because at the very least, the first week of the photosynthesis lab was just a pre-lab lecture, and all you had to do was be there, and you got the full 20 points. So just keep that in mind. Use that time next week. I'll make sure I'm online during office hours. I'll make sure that Elijah is available for you. So if you need help fixing a lab, or if you want to meet me to get feedback for a lab, or whatever it is you may need, next week is the time to do it. All right, less than 1 minute.
So
All right, it's 8 o'clock, so we'll get started. Also, I'll let you know, like I said, office hours are going to be virtual because I'm not on campus, but I'm not sure how good my reception is going to be when I leave this room and all the usual stuff. So if you need me and you log on like we are right now to try to talk to me at 9 o'clock, if I'm not here, just call my office phone number, and it will be forwarded to my cell phone. But let's go ahead and jump into it since we are behind. Let me get my volume up. So to remind you, once I start sharing my screen, I can't see anything but the PowerPoint. So if you guys need me, you'll have to use your microphone and get my attention that way. Now let's jump into it. And I want to reiterate one thing because I don't remember how good of a job I did reiterating this on Wednesday, but oops, excuse me. Come on. Yep, new computer. I'm trying to get used to this mouse pad. Anyway, There we go. So to be clear, this PowerPoint combines chapter 20 and chapter 21, right? So, and I will remind you, so this is a little bit out of order and it's a different order than what's in your textbook because I'm using the PowerPoint from the old textbook, but the concepts are the same. You just need to, they're just a little bit out of order. So here we go. Let's officially get started. The first official word for it, attendance, will be Andrew, like the name Andrew. That's in honor of Dr. Andrew Shadle from the physics department who died yesterday. So let's talk about mutualism. All right, actually, let me back up. To remind you, right now what we're talking about is different types of interspecific interactions. And the first one we talked about was interspecific competition, which is competition between different species, which is a negative, right? It's bad for both, so to speak. So now we're talking about mutualism, and this is pretty common. You've probably heard about this growing up in all your science classes in middle school, high school, maybe even elementary school. Mutualism is a plus. It is when both species benefit. So I'll give you this description, and I'll remind you for the exam, I'm not going to ask you the definition of mutualism, but I'll give you some sort of example, and you need to recognize that example as mutualism. So here we go. Here's one example. There's something called a symbiotic root fungus associations, and it's called mycorrhizae. You don't need to know this. That's just an exam. But what happens is there's fungus that lives on the roots of plants, and they both kind of need each other. The fungus delivers mineral nutrients to the plants, right? So the plant is really good at doing photosynthesis, right? It can make carbohydrates, no problem. But there are some mineral nutrients that it can't get without the fungi. Meanwhile, the fungus, in exchange for providing those mineral nutrients to the plant, also receives organic nutrients from the plant. Again, carbohydrates and things like that. Let me back out of here because I hear a noise. So let me see what that's about. I apologize. I don't know what that was about. I don't see anything. All right, well, all right, again, if you guys need me, say it verbally. Otherwise, I don't know what you need. Anyway, so that's an example of mutualism. Here's another example of mutualism. Corals depend on algae that live inside the cells of each coral polyp, right? So when coral, just so you know, not that you need to know this, but a coral is a type of animal. Like, it looks like a plant because it doesn't move and it's, it just sits there, but it is actually an animal. And again, as you can see here, they have algae that live inside the cells of each coral, which is interesting because think about that. I'm not saying it's inside the body of the coral. It is inside each one of the cells, right? Which brings up a good question for independent work if you want to look into it. At what point do you consider those two different organisms one organism, right? For example, and I don't want to go down too much of a sidetrack here because you don't need to know this and I'm not going to test you on it, but it's worth thinking about. The leading theory of how plants even got chloroplast organelles, the leading theory is there was a cell billions of years ago that basically engulfed another cell, and that one cell that was engulfed was photosynthetic. So at that point, we had plant cells. That's a very basic description. I'm not giving it enough justice. But anyway, yeah, so the point being, the question I'm asking, if you want to look it up, something to think about is, at what point are the relationships between these organisms so close that we consider them the same organism? But anyway, yeah, back to the example. Corals are a great example of mutualism because they have algae live inside the cells. Where do they get the sugars that the algae produce, right? Because they're photosynthetic, that, they give those to the coral. That provides the coral with energy. And in exchange, the algae get shelter, right? And also the waste products, right? So again, coral is an animal, and what do animals do? They respire, right? They use use oxygen that put out carbon dioxide. What do photosynthetic organisms need? They need carbon dioxide. Another thing that all animals put off is some sort of ammonia waste. For humans, that is urine. But anyway, yeah, so that's another thing that plants need. Any questions about this so far? All right. If you download the PowerPoint, you can see this little video that shows clownfish and sea anemone. That's a good example of mutualism. Actually, and for all these, now that I think about it, any of these would be good short independent work topics, right? Just look up a different example of mutualism that I didn't give. Look up a different example of interspecific competition that I didn't give. Look up any examples of the things I'm about to tell you that I didn't give. But let's move forward and talk about predation. This one's really easy. Everyone's heard of predation, right? That's when one species kills another, right? The species that does the killing is called the predator. The species that's getting killed is called the prey. That part's pretty simple. The part that's only slightly more complicated is when we talk about the ways, the evolution of it, right? Because there's been numerous adaptations for predators to avoid the prey, right? So they've evolved these adaptations. And we'll give you some examples on the following slides. Actually, before I even go to the following slides, I don't know, does anybody, obviously you look at this zebra and it's sticking out, right? So that seems like bad camouflage because it's black and white and then you've got that green background. But think about it. When there's a bunch of zebras, when there's thousands of zebras running every which way, and they're all striped like that, then they are kind of camouflaged, at least amongst themselves, right? So as a tiger, or excuse me, as a lion, it's a little bit harder to pick out one individual zebra. It's just a big black and white barcoded mess. Anyway, some other examples for that the prey have evolved to escape predation. We have speed, right? Some examples of that are antelopes, right? Antelopes are very fast. Rabbits are very fast. There's also mechanical structures, right? Think about porcupines, sharp quills. Clams have hard shells, right? So you can think of probably hundreds of examples. So, and again, very easy independent work topic. Even then, though, make sure you use sources. And I know that sounds silly, especially in this case. Like if you just write a paper, like another good example of mechanical structures is turtles have shells. And we all know turtles have shells, but still provide a reference. It's good practice. Anyway, any questions so far? All right, the next word for attendance, again, in honor of Dr. Shadle, who passed away yesterday morning, will be physics, since he was in the physics department. All right, some other ways of avoiding predation. So we talked about speed, we talked about mechanical structures, and then of course there's camouflage. As a matter of fact, that's the first thing we talked about because that's the picture I just happened to use. And zebras, as odd as it seems in this picture, you know, they are camouflaged in a different way. Another word for camouflage is called cryptic coloration. And as you might imagine, it makes potential prey difficult to find. I should fix that when I get a chance. Yeah, difficult to find. Oh, that's not working. I'm not using a mouse. I'm using this mouse pad on my new computer, and it's killing me. Here's some examples, right? I don't know if you can see it, but here we have. Sorry guys. Here we have a spider. Here we have a seahorse. Right. This whole thing's a frog. Right. So again, just great examples of camouflage. And once again, great independent work topic if you want to come up with some other examples of camouflage. And again, if you download the PowerPoint, you can watch this little animation that shows those seahorses among the coral and how they're camouflaged. And then there's yet another way to avoid predation, and this one's called warning coloration. And in a sense, it's kind of like the opposite of camouflage. They don't want to be camouflaged; they want to be seen. Usually, they use yellow, red, or orange with black marks because, you know, again, it's very visible. And what that signals to the predator is that these animals have effective chemical defenses, right? So if another animal would try to eat this frog or that butterfly or this caterpillar or that sea slug, I believe, it wouldn't be good, right? It could be very poisonous or it could be just a bad taste, whatever the case may be. The point is it's not good. And predators generally see these colors and know better than to eat them. Usually because they learned the hard way earlier in their life. But Any questions about warning coloration? All right. I don't know if I want to call this a subcategory, but on the topic of warning coloration, we have something called mimicry. Mimicry is sort of like warning coloration. I mean, it is warning coloration, except in this case, they're kind of faking the funk, so to speak. So in this case, they are giving off those bright colors, so they're very visible, and they are trying to warn the predator, like, hey, I'm poisonous. But the thing is, in this case, they're not poisonous. Or in this case, in this example, because we're talking about snakes, the word is venomous, not poisonous, because the harm is when they bite you, not when you eat them. But anyway, this is one example. We have coral snake on one side, we have, which is very dangerous, and we have the king snake on the other, and it's not dangerous. And I remember these were pretty big in Florida when I was a kid, and they always taught us, what was it? Red on black, friend of Jack, right? So red on, like this one on the left, red on yellow, kill a fellow. So that's how I remembered that this would be the king snake over here. And then we have the coral snake over here. Any questions? So again, I'll remind you, because I haven't reminded you in a few slides, these are all examples. I'm not going to ask you questions about these king snakes and coral snakes or monarch butterflies or all of these things. These are just examples. I'm not going to ask you any questions about examples or about those examples. So here's an interesting combination. Some insects combine protective coloration with their adaptations of disguises. So this is kind of some insects. Basically what I'm saying is combine some of the things that we talked about earlier. On one hand, they can be camouflage. For example, I'm sure you guys have seen insects that resemble twigs or leaves or even bird poop, right? They can look like that. Some of them can even imitate vertebrates, right? So I'll give you an example on the next slide, but there are some caterpillars that on one side, they're camouflage, right? They're not meant to be seen. But then when they are seen, they're like, all right, well, I'm giving up this trying to hide thing. Let me try to scare them. And they kind of flip over and then they look like a snake. So there you go. You can see the caterpillar on the left and the snake on the right, or an actual snake, but that's what it looks like. And if I remember correctly, this picture's not from your textbook, but another great example of mimicry, but a different type of mimicry, right? And again, these are just examples. I'm not going to ask you any questions about them, and you can do your own research and give me some more examples of insects that try to look like other things, either as a way of hiding or as a way of scaring off its prey. All right, the next one's also very easy. You've learned about this your whole life. It's called herbivory, and that is the consumption of plant parts or algae by an animal, right? So an animal eats basically something that's photosynthetic, that is herbivory. So when you eat lettuce, that's herbivory. Or when a caterpillar eats a leaf, that's herbivory, right? It's not usually bad, or it's not usually fatal, but it's usually still bad. But again, just like when we were talking about predation, right? That's a very simple concept. But then we started talking about the ways that the prey evolved to get away from the predator. In this case, let's talk about how plants have evolved ways of not being eaten. I'm sure you've encountered some of them, like roses that are on thorns, right? The spines that are on cacti, trichomes, which is what I did my master's degree thesis in. Trichomes are the little hairs on plants, and they actually do help. Sometimes the insects just can't eat the plants because the trichomes are in the way. Sometimes the trichomes have things in them. As a matter of fact, that's where a lot of the THC from marijuana is found, is in the little hairs on the plant. Also, chemical toxins, and I'm going to talk about all these a little bit more on the next slide. Were there any questions so far? All right, some examples. And again, these are just examples. I'm not going to test you on any of these, and any examples you can think of that are not on this list, feel free to send them my way for independent work, and don't forget your sources. But again, like I already said, thorns on a rose bush, spikes on cacti. There's a lot of vines that have poison, or shoot, this list came from your textbook. But now that I think about it, a better example from this would be, forget a tropical vine, what about poison ivy, right? Even on our own backyards, we have poison that's produced by a vine. And here's where it gets a little bit interesting too, from this stuff from here on down. What I find interesting, and I read a lot about this kind of stuff, is a lot of the things that plants have done to keep animals from eating them. Um, Humans have been like, hey, I like that. Let's start using it, right? So, for example, morphine, right? We get morphine from the opium, the poppy flowers, right? So they evolved that so they wouldn't be eaten, and then humans are like, oh yeah, let's get some opium. Same with nicotine, right? Nicotine was evolved as a chemical defense from insects eating them, but then humans figured out, hey, we can smoke that and it would be good. There's all kinds of examples. You can see them here, peppermint, cloves, cinnamon, all these flavors that humans like. Hot peppers is a great example. Hot peppers, only mammals can feel the heat. And evolutionarily, the reason for that is because birds can eat hot peppers. They can't feel the heat. So birds will eat hot peppers, they'll swallow them, they'll go fly around, and then they'll poop the seeds out, right? So if you're a plant, you would much rather have generally speaking, a bird eating your seeds, because they're going to spread your seeds a lot more than a mammal would, for example. So again, just some examples, and I find it very fascinating how these plants have evolved ways of keeping animals from eating them, and humans are like, yeah, that's good stuff. Let's kill them and eat them. Of course, on the flip side of that, you have to consider, if it wasn't for humans liking the flavor of peppermint and cloves and cinnamon and the feeling of nicotine and morphine, if it wasn't for all that, humans probably wouldn't be cultivating them, right? So evolutionarily, I guess it did kind of work. Like, yeah, we're still eating them or smoking them or whatever, but we're also still growing them. So they probably wouldn't be so prevalent if humans didn't get involved. Anyway, any questions about these examples of how plants have evolved to avoid herbivory? All right, these are some pictures of what we're talking about. That's what peppermint looks like. This is what cloves look like. That's what cinnamon looks like. It's just, cinnamon is basically just the bark of a tree. What is it? I read something yesterday I was going to tell you about. Yes, I read something yesterday from the West Virginia Department of Agriculture's Facebook page. They were talking about keeping ticks away from your yard. And they mentioned things like growing peppermint or growing mint in your yard. Because I thought, what great timing for me to see that, because I'm about to talk about this tomorrow in lecture. So yeah. Anyway, any questions about those examples? All right, let's talk about parasites and pathogens. This is also pretty straightforward. Parasites are something that live on or in a host from which they obtain nutrients. Now, if we just left it at that one bullet point, then you might be thinking, well, how's that different than the algae that lives inside the coral, right? Because the algae lives inside the host from which it obtains nutrients, right? But these sub bullet points kind of break that down. In this case, it's beneficial for one species but harmful for the other, right? So in the other case, the coral and the algae both benefited from the relationship, which is why it was mutualism. In this case, it's hurting the one species, it's hurting, the host, but it helps the parasite, and that's what makes it parasitism and not mutualism. Some examples include the second bullet point here. Again, I'm not going to test you on those examples. And again, I'm not going to, or you could look up some other examples. Also, even let me just point this out without getting too deep in it. Tapeworm is a very broad category, right? You could look into, for example, there's tapeworms that only infect humans. There's tapeworms that only infect dogs. There's tapeworms that only infect sharks. We've got somebody in Hamlin Hall. His name's Dr. Runke. That's basically what his research is. He goes around the world and catches sharks and gets the tapeworms out of them, and he studies them. And he's actually found quite a few new species. But anyway, let's get back to it. So that's a parasite. Any questions about what a parasite is? All right. I will point one thing out, and I don't remember if it's in the textbook or not, but the thing about parasites is, yes, it's beneficial for the parasite and it hurts the host. But generally, it's not necessarily deadly, right? It's definitely can really impact their health in a negative way, but it's not always deadly. Because think about it, evolutionarily, if a parasite takes too many nutrients from the host to the point where the host dies, then so does the parasite, right? That parasite is stuck in that host. So if the host dies, so does the parasite. Oh yeah, let me give you one other example. I thought this was cool because I had to take a parasitology class when I was in undergrad. When I was in undergrad or graduate school. Sorry, I got distracted. Anyway, one of the examples that they gave, and I thought this was really crazy. I think they were hookworms. I think you've probably heard of hookworms, but the way hookworms work is when it rains, they're in the soil. Their eggs they're in the soil. They hatch, and they kind of like reach up towards the sky, waiting for something to step on them or touch them. So what happens is when humans walk around barefoot and they step on them, and this is where it gets really crazy, they crawl in through their flesh, right through the bottom of their feet, and they make their way all the way through the human's body until they hit the lungs. And then they get inside the lungs and they lay their eggs. And then, oh yeah, sorry, I was wrong with the egg part in the soil. But anyway, they lay their eggs in the lungs. Then they hatch in the lungs. So now you've got, wait, hold on, let me think. Nope, sorry, they don't hatch in the lungs yet, but the eggs are in the lungs. And then when people cough, like that, because they've got a bunch of worm eggs in their lungs, and then they swallow, then it goes through their digestive system, and then they get pooped out, and then the process continues, right? And that used to be a big thing back in the day before we had plumbing. But one of the other interesting things I thought about it, and I need to hurry up, I'm wasting a lot of time here, sorry. But people who used to use like chewing tobacco or snuff or dip or whatever back in the day, they were less affected by tapeworms, these hookworms, because they were spitting all the time, right? So when they coughed up those eggs, and once the eggs came out of their lungs when they coughed, instead of swallowing it so that they could go into their digestive system, they'd spit them out. Not because they were meaning to, like I'm going to spit out these eggs. Everybody would do that if they knew that was what was happening. They were just spitting because that's what they did with tobacco. But anyway, moving forward, let's talk about pathogens really quickly. Pathogens are things that cause diseases, right? So bacteria, viruses, fungi, protists, a lot of things we've talked about before. Any questions about this slide? All right, the next word for attendance. The next word for attendance is Mars, like the planet Mars. And again, this is in honor of Dr. Shadle, who passed away yesterday. But when I was an undergrad, I did some research with him, and we were looking at impact craters from meteor strikes on Mars. Anyway, the last point here for interspecific interactions is commensalism. Just go through this one very quickly. Commensalism is when one species benefits and the other is not helped or harmed, right? So it's not, it's not like, here's an example. When a seahorse benefits by matching the coral to hide, like we talked about earlier, right? We give that example of camouflage. So that helps the seahorse, obviously, but it's not really helping the coral or hurting it, right? The coral, one way or the other, it doesn't matter to it, but it does help the seahorse. And that is commensalism. And again, I will not ask you questions about examples. I will just give you some other example, and you'll have to recognize it as commensalism, or parasite, or pathogen, or herbivory, predation, mutualism, so on and so forth. Any questions about that? Okay. If you download this PowerPoint, you can get this little table. If I remember correctly, this picture is not from your current textbook. So, again, if you're studying, this will be a good little PowerPoint to study, because everything I just talked about is right there on one slide, right? You can see how it's competition's a negative, negative, and mutualism's a positive, positive, all these things. So any questions about this slide? All right, finally, we're done with interspecific interactions, and we can talk about trophic structure. Trophic structure is the feeding relationships among species in a community. In other words, you've been taught this your whole life. Now we're just giving it another name. You probably heard of it as a food chain or a food web, right? That's all those are all basically trophic structures. So the trophic structure determines the passage of energy and nutrients from plants to herbivores to predators. Of course, I put a little star here because depending on the ecosystem, it might not start with plants, right? It might be photosynthetic bacteria, or it might be algae. But either way, as we know from way back earlier in the semester, it all starts with photosynthetic organisms, right? Photoautotrophs. Anyway, the sequence of transfer between trophic levels is called a food chain. So any questions about this slide before we talk more about this subject? All right. Here's two examples of food chains. So we have an aquatic one on the right and a terrestrial one on the left. And again, right, you start with the primary producers, which are autotrophs, and then you have the primary consumers that eat them. Then you have the secondary consumers that eat them, tertiary consumers that eat them, and then finally the top of the food chain, which is the quaternary consumers. Yeah, again, as always, I'm not going to ask you to memorize these examples that you can see on this picture. These are just examples. So any questions so far? All right, I will say this, there will be a test question, and people get this wrong often, and I don't mean for it to be tricky, so I'm going to tell you what it is right now. I'll say something, I'll describe a food chain, right? And I might, for example, describe this thing, right? Like this, there's a mouse, and the mouse eats a grasshopper that eats a plant, right? I might describe that situation. And then I might say, what is the mouse? And in this multiple choice exam, your options are going to be primary producers, primary consumers, secondary consumers, tertiary consumers, right? Those will be your options. And I think what really confuses people in the test situation is they think, all right, primary producer, and in their mind, since they started with primary, then they kind of jump all the way to secondary, right? They make this jump right here. So don't forget, the thing that eats the plants, the thing that eats the primary producer is called the primary consumer. So don't let that mess you up on the exam. It's not meant to be a trick question. It's actually meant to be an easy one. But anyway, before we move forward, I'll point this out. This is very simple. We've already talked about this before, but everything down here, right? You've got producers, and then everything else is consumers or are consumers. So any questions about that slide? Pierce, 1 second, guys, online. I apologize. Can you go to that room? I'll send it there. And tell her what's going on, okay? All right, sorry, guys. Anyway, let's get back to this. Again, herbivores are primary consumers, right? So and again, I don't want this to trick you on the exam. Herbivores are the second step up, right? And that's what confuses people in their brain. If they're like, all right, that's step 2. So their brain just goes automatically to secondary. But remember, you've got your producers and then your primary consumers, and then the thing that eats the primary consumers, and the thing that eats the secondary consumers, and the thing that eats the tertiary consumers, so on and so forth. And you'll notice here, in this case, we're still technically talking about food chains, but I decided to put in a food pyramid instead. And we'll talk a little bit about this later, but yeah, still the concepts are the same because we start with primary producers, and then primary consumers, so on and so forth. Another thing I like about this too is it also includes this, right? This is also part of the story, right? The soils, the decomposers, and they're interesting because, they digest everything that dies or all the poop, right? That gets digested by the decomposers. But anyway, we'll come back to that. Oh yeah, that's this slide right here, right? Some consumers derive their energy from stuff called detritus, which is just dead material, right? So dead leaves, poop, dead animals, all that kind of stuff. So these consumers are called decomposers. Excuse me. it's kind of broken down, right? So anything that eats detritus, there's like three different levels, and I might have you know the difference between them, not necessarily with these examples, like, oh, an example of a scavenger is a crow, an example of a detritivore is a millipede, an example of a decomposer is a fungi, right? Probably won't ask you that, but I do want you to know the relationship between the three, and it's basically a size thing, right? So scavengers will find dead carcasses, right? Dead animals, right? So you see like roadkill on the side of the road, you see a crow eating it. That's a good example of a scavenger. And then a step down from that, we're talking about something smaller. You have things like detritivores. So again, for example, in earthworms, you can put earthworms in your compost bins and they help break it down into soil because they'll eat things like old leaves and grass clippings and stuff like that. And their poop basically turns it into dirt. And then from there, we have decomposers. So the decomposers can take that dirt and decompose it even more. So decomposers, we're looking at things at the molecular level, right? So these two are like really just breaking things down physically, right? Like turning it in from a body to smaller parts or poop or the dirt or whatever. But then decomposers do what we really need, right? So when you think about, again, throwing it back to earlier in the semester, we need 20 amino acids to build all the proteins in our body. And some of those amino acids, we have to eat them because our body can't produce them. So we get it from our food. And where does our food get it? From the decomposers, because the decomposers will take, for example, a protein that might be found on the soil, for example, and break it down into its amino acids, right? So anyway, any questions about the relationship between scavengers, detritivores, or decomposers? All right, the next word for attendance, since it's on the screen, will be crows, like the black crows. There's a good example. So like I was saying, there's a compost bin, right? So if you've ever composted, you would know that you want some earthworms in there because earthworms will help turn that stuff, that old rotten food, into to soil. All right, so while we're talking about trophic structure, let's talk about biological magnification. And lucky for you, if you did Lab 11, which is the video about the poisoned waters video, then you've already been exposed to this concept because when they took the documentary to the Seattle area, to the Puget Sound, that's what they were talking about, right? They were talking about those PCBs in the water. And the PCBs did this biological magnification. So let's talk about it. So the thing is, a lot of toxins cannot be metabolized by organisms, meaning, again, just using PCB as an example, when PCB gets into the body of an organism, it doesn't break it down, right? So unlike using the same example from earlier, proteins, right? When you eat proteins, your body digests it, right? So it turns those proteins into a bunch of different amino acids. But toxins cannot be broken down, or a lot of them cannot be broken down. Therefore, they remain in the body of the organism. Therefore, anything that eats that organism then gets the toxin. And that's where we get this idea of biological magnification, which basically says as you go up the food chain, right, from producer, to the primary consumer, secondary consumer, so on and so forth, as you go up the food chain, then the concentration of these toxins increases. And let's talk about why. So yeah, that's what I was trying to draw. And this is an example. Oh, here we go. This is from your old textbook, but it's perfect, right? Like I said, PCBs, right? So there's a little bit of PCBs in the water in the Puget Sound. So you've got these little microscopic things living, these little microscopic animals, zooplankton technically. So they absorb some of those toxins a little bit, right? For every one, there's 1 nanogram of that toxin for every gram in their body, right? But now the cod is going around eating a bunch of these things. So therefore, they're going to have higher concentrations, specifically 10 nanograms per gram. And then the salmon are eating the cod, right? They eat a bunch of cod. Therefore, they're getting even more. So they're having 90 nanograms per gram. And then finally, humans eat the salmon, and therefore that gets even higher concentrations of 350 nanograms per gram. I will put a big old X through this just to remind or to indicate I'm not going to ask you anything about this example. You don't need to memorize any of these numbers or the fact that zooplankton's eaten by cod, which is eaten by salmon, so on and so forth. But it is a really good example. And if any of you have ever been pregnant or know anybody who's been pregnant, I'm sure you know that they have dietary restrictions. And one of the things they can't eat are certain large fish. And this is one of the reasons why. And not just for PCB either, things like mercury, other stuff too. But it all comes back to biological magnification. Excuse me. Any questions about this slide? All right, so let's talk about food webs. We're done talking about food chains, which is a very basic way of looking at things. But food webs, they're more realistic, so to speak, right? So very few communities on Earth are so simple that they're characterized by an unbranched food chain. So basically all the stuff we talked about earlier, like I just said, it's a very good, simple way of looking at things. It's good for studying concepts, but in all reality, that's not a very realistic situation. So the feeding relationships in a community are actually woven into something called food webs, right? And they're a lot more elaborate, they're a lot more realistic, and I'll give you some examples in the slides that are coming up. And another thing that we didn't discuss when we talked about the food chain were omnivores, right? So we talked about primary producers, primary consumers, secondary consumers, so on and so forth. But we didn't talk about omnivores, and I'm sure you already know what an omnivore is, but just in case you didn't, that is something that eats both producers and consumers. Like most humans are omnivores, right? When you sit down and have a chicken salad, or a salad, grilled chicken salad, you're eating producers and consumers all in that one salad. Anyway, so even this picture, which is, I think, from your old textbook, even this is an oversimplified version of what's actually happening. But you can see even this is more complicated than a food chain, right? It's not straight up, this thing eats this thing and this thing eats that thing, right? It's a little bit more complicated. We can see, again, here's an omnivore, right? So this omnivore, sometimes it eats primary consumers, sometimes it's eating producers, right? And again, this is just an example. You don't need to study this and memorize anything, but it does a great job of showing how complicated it is, right? It's not just one species eats one other species, right? It's this thing eats this thing or that thing, but it also eats this thing and so on and so forth. But still, we're still dealing with producers and primary consumers and secondary, tertiary, quaternary, so on and so forth. But again, the point is, it's not as simple as straight up and down the food chain, right? It's more complicated. And I will point this out very quickly, because this is only one aspect of it, but this is one reason that biodiversity is so important, right? Because the more species you have, the more intricate this is, meaning the stronger that ecosystem is, right? So if you have a lot of pieces and they're all interconnected, then generally speaking, if you lose one piece, it's less harmful, right? So in this picture, if we lost this species right here, I get things would probably be maybe okay, especially compared to, good grief, especially compared to, where is it? This, right? So in this case, if you were to lose this species, right, the way this is drawn, then everything would die, right? Because, it's a straight food chain. So anyway, again, biodiversity is important. Any questions about that food web? All right, we'll talk about, speaking of biodiversity, let's talk about species diversity in communities. And I mentioned this earlier in the chapter. That was Wednesday. I've talked about this, but now here it is in writing. So let's officially talk about it. When we're talking about species diversity, there's two ways that we kind of quantify it, so to speak. There's species richness versus relative abundance. And you need to know the difference between these two in the exam. It's not that I'm going to ask you which is which, but again, I'll probably give you an example and then you have to recognize it. Am I describing species richness or am I describing relative abundance? So really quickly, species richness is simply the number of different species. So again, if we were in Hamlin Hall right now and there was 10 oh man, this is going to drive me crazy. 10 humans, I don't know, and let's say it's bring your pet to school day. So 10 humans, 2 dogs, 1 cat, 3 iguanas, right? So right here, the species richness is simply 1, 2, 3, 4, right? There's 4 different species. We've got humans, dogs, cats, and iguanas. Now, relative abundance is now when we're looking at the proportional representation. So the species, again, species richness is 4 because there's 4 of them. But when we're talking about relative abundance, now we're looking at the fact like, okay, in this particular situation, there's a lot more humans, followed by a few number of iguanas, fewer numbers of dogs, and even fewer numbers of cats. But let me just show you the next slide as a better example. So here we have 2 different woodlands, right? Woodland A and woodland B. And if you look at it, the species richness is the same. You've got this big old like oak looking tree. You have this type of pine tree, another type of pine tree, another type of pine tree, right? So we have what? 1, 2, 3, 4. Species richness up here is 4. Species richness down here is also 4, right? You can see it's the same 4 species. But if I were to give you this picture on an exam and ask you which of these woodlands has a higher biodiversity, the answer would be B, right? So yes, when it comes to species richness, they're the same. They only have the 4 different species, but you can see woodland B, it's more even. So any questions about the relationship between species richness and relative abundance? All right, and then here's just a graph of the woodlands we saw, right? Woodland A versus woodland B. And again, when it comes to species richness, they are the same. But when it comes to relative abundance, woodland B, you can see has a more equal representation of all the species. So it's has a higher biodiversity. Which brings us to something called keystone species, right? So here we talk about how, when everything's equal, that's higher biodiversity. And then we have, and also, let me bring it back to this quickly. When we talked about this, right? I said, all right, if we lose this one mouse, that's probably not going to be that big of a deal because there's a lot of other things in this food web, right? And the more things there are in the food web, the less important one single species is, generally speaking. But the big exception to that rule is this: keystone species. Those are species whose impact on the ecosystem are much larger than the total mass or abundance indicates. Meaning, if you look up here, again, in woodland A, this is like the predominant species, right? So you might say that's a very important species in woodland A, and you'd be right? Because it's mostly that species. But then here we only have like one of these, right? So you might look at that and say, well, that's a very unimportant species in that ecosystem because there's only one of them, right? Or another way of saying there's only one of them is this right here. The total mass or abundance. That's what I mean, right? There's not that many of whatever organism we're talking about, whatever species we're talking about. And here's some examples. So you have these aquatic, this is a real experiment somebody did. They went into this coastal area, I believe it was on the Pacific Northwest, and they had these little pools, right? So the water comes in when high tide, then the water goes out at low tide, but there's still these pools left when the water goes out in high tide, and there's things living in them. Specifically, there was these sea stars or starfish, whatever you want to call them, right? And those are the predators in that ecosystem. So what happened was the scientists went and they just removed all these sea stars from the area. So then what happened was, because the predators were gone, then the things that the predators ate, which are the mussels, their population exploded, right? Obviously there's a whole bunch of them because there was nothing there to eat them. And because of that, they outcompeted the other species. So remember, I'll try to draw the graph here. This goes back to another concept we talked about, where we talked about how, actually the graph won't even help you, but we talked about how the competitive the exclusion principle, right? So if you have competing species in the same ecosystem with similar niches, they can't coexist at the same time. And then remember, I told you, but that's not always the case because predators help keep things balanced. Because as one species gets too high in numbers, then the predator eats it, right? But in this case, that doesn't happen because the predator is gone. Therefore, again, the mussels outcompeted everything else. And because of that, the number of species in that ecosystem dropped from over 15 to less than 8. And here's what I'm talking. Well, that's not what the picture is. There we go. So again, when you had that starfish, then this on the left was what the ecosystem looked like, right? These were all the different species in that ecosystem. But then once you got rid of that starfish, you can see it's only one species that you got rid of. But then because you got rid of all those different species, then you have much fewer species, right? So again, their impact was much larger than their total mass or abundance indicated, right? So it's not like there was a bunch of starfish. There's only a few of them. But once you got rid of them, that completely messed up the ecosystem. Another example, and then we'll move on, is sea otters, right? The sea otter is a keystone species because the sea otter eats these sea urchins, right? And the sea urchins eat the kelp. And what this picture doesn't show is there's a lot of fish that rely on that kelp for food and for a place to hide from predators and a place to lay their eggs, so on and so forth. So when you remove the sea otter, then the sea urchins become, they explode, the population explodes. Therefore, they eat too much kelp. Therefore, the kelp is gone. And therefore, all the different fish and all the other organisms that relied on the kelp, they don't have it anymore. So again, you remove this one species and then the whole ecosystem collapse. And that's what you call a keystone species. And again, for the exam, I'm most likely not going to ask you to define what it is. I'm most likely going to give you an example, and you need to recognize that as a keystone species. So any questions about keystone species? All right, let's talk about disturbances and secession in communities. We have 3 minutes and some change. Let's say that'll be the next word for attendance, change. And probably I'll just have time to do this introduction, and then we'll probably quit and pick it up on Monday, but let's talk about it. Here we go. What is a disturbance? You need to know what a disturbance is. They are episodes that damage communities, so when I say communities, I'm not talking about like the community of Nitro. I mean, we're talking about biological communities, right? All the living species interacting with each other. So anyway, a disturbance is something that damages them, at least temporarily, by destroying the organisms and altering the availability of resources. So some examples include storms, fires, floods, droughts. We've had some, and I'm sure, remember those bad storms we had a couple weeks ago? When a tree falls down, that's a disturbance. In that case, it's not much of a disturbance, but it is technically a disturbance. Speaking of which, these small scale natural disturbances that I just described as one example can have positive effects on biological community. And I say can, they can also have negative, but that's what that little star is about. They can have a positive effect. Sometimes they don't. And again, this is the example that I just gave, right? A large tree falls in a windstorm and that creates new habitats. So there's a picture of it from the old textbook. So this used to be, and I'm sure you guys have been in the woods and been into like a field next to the woods. This is a completely different species, right? When you have a bunch of trees up, there's not a lot of sun getting to the bottom of the, to the floor of the forest because all the tall trees are blocking it out. So you have species of plants living at the bottom that don't need a lot of sun, right? That's species that are good with shade, right? This is just one example. So now this tree falls down. Now all of a sudden you've got a lot of sun. So now all of a sudden species that are good with a lot of sun can now thrive there. Not only that, but I don't know if you can see in this picture, but when this tree fell down, it left like a little crater, right? And that crater is now filled with water. So now we've got like a little pond, right? We have a whole little aquatic ecosystem that probably has, frogs, tadpoles, insect larvae, all kinds of stuff living in there, right? All these new ecosystems just because the one tree fell down, right? So all these new species that are here now that were not there until the tree fell down. So again, sometimes these disturbances, especially small scale ones like this, can be beneficial for the ecosystem because they can increase biodiversity. Yeah, so we've got 1 minute left. Now we can do this last slide. Humans are the most significant agent of ecological disturbance. So yeah, we've got things like windstorms and hurricanes, things like that, which are natural and they're big, but humans are actually, we cause more damage than that. And one consequences of this You know what? No, that is where we're in. So when we come back on Monday, we'll pick up with this and then we can even start talking about, for example, COVID-19 and how it came to be, at least how we think it came to be. So the last word for attendance will be humans. Humans is the last word for attendance. Make sure you guys get those words sent to me by 9 a.m. Like I said, I'm going to try to stay on for office hours, but it's going to be wonky. So if you need me and you can't reach me on my computer, just call my office phone and it will be forwarded to my cell phone. So you guys have a great weekend. And again, I am traveling, so I apologize for being slow to respond to emails or to grade anything, but it is Greek Easter or Orthodox Easter. So have a great weekend.